1847, or Black 47, is the most famous or maybe infamous year of the Great Irish Famine. But it's all down to a series of decisions taken in 1846, and that was in so many ways the point of no return for Ireland. After what happened in 1846, which I'm about to share with you in this video, Irish history was changed forever. Just before we set off on that journey to 1846, let me introduce myself. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian. I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast. You can find a link to that below. Now, this video is part of a series that explores the history of the Great Irish Famine. If you want to check beneath this video, you'll find links to other parts of that series where I explore what led up to 1846. I'm also going to be making videos where I respond to your comments. So if you have any questions about what I'm talking about, just drop a comment. I'll have a video out tomorrow that answers some of the comments from this video and other videos as well. But now let's get into the story of 1846 and why that was the point of no return. So if you had the misfortune of finding yourself back in Ireland in the spring of 1846, the situation might surprise you. I think most people were probably a lot more optimistic about what lay ahead than we might imagine. So by the spring of 1846, Ireland had experienced a major crisis. In previous videos, I've explained how the potato crop, which fed about 3 million people, had partially failed in the autumn of 1845. This plunged Irish society into a crisis, but people had survived. They had all these strategies of survival. They used up whatever savings they had. They sold their own tools, their equipment, in order to get some money. And in 1846, people hoped the worst of that crisis was behind them and they could look forward to a new harvest that would bring in a fresh crop and everything would return to normal. However, those hopes were dashed in June and July of 1846 when blight, the fungus that had destroyed the potato crop in 1845, returned, but it returned much earlier. So it started to appear on potato plants in June and July, and this would lead to a catastrophic situation, because 80% of all potatoes right across the island were lost as this fungus devastated the crop. And this meant the crisis was actually even worse than it had been in 1845, but the situation was far worse now because, as I've already explained, people had used up all their savings or they'd sold whatever they could and now they had nothing left. So they were completely dependent on the British government, which ruled Ireland at the time, to help them in this hour of need. Now, to understand why 1846 becomes this point of no return, we now need to go to London and look at what was happening in Britain as the British government is going to decide what they're going to do as Ireland faces this catastrophe. So in the first year of the crisis engulfing Ireland after the failure of the potato crop in 1845, the British government responsible for dealing with it was a Conservative administration led by a man called Sir Robert Peel. However, he lost power in early 1846 and was replaced by a man called Lord John Russell. Now, Russell was the leader of a liberal administration. The word liberal meant something very different in the 19th century than it does today. And it's really important to get a sense of who he was because he would take a series of decisions that basically pushed Ireland past that point of no return. So, like all British politicians at the time, Russell would have had a pretty racist view of Ireland. He also tended to believe that most of the reports coming from Ireland about how bad the situation was tended to be exaggerated. This was a very common idea in Britain at the time. So in the summer of 1846, when the potato crop fails completely across the island, plunging Ireland into a catastrophic situation, he is faced with calls from Ireland for major intervention. People are desperate, they can see this major catastrophe coming. But Russell, like his government colleagues, his Chancellor of the Exchequer is a man called Charles Wood. He's a very influential guy in all this, but they are committed to laissez-faire economics, and that's that the government should intervene in society, but particularly the economy, as little as possible. They believe if you let the free market operate, it's the most efficient way for society to function and even deal with crises like the Great Famine, and this shapes everything they do. So in the summer of 1846, you have all these calls from Ireland to stop the export of the harvest that's coming. Because while the potato crop is destroyed, there are lots of other crops being produced in Ireland. There's also large cattle herds. But traditionally, most of this, or a lot of this food, was exported out of Ireland, primarily to Britain, but also some of it went to the US. So there's calls immediately to impose an embargo in Ireland to stop this food being exported. But because Russell and his government colleagues are absolutely wedded to this idea of the free market, they're completely opposed to this idea. And they insist that as the harvest is brought in September and October of that year, that that harvest is exported in the way it had been over previous years. Now this leads to major upheaval, as you can imagine, in a lot of the southern ports in Ireland. So a lot of the fertile land in Ireland is in the southern half of the country. And each autumn, the harvest was gathered and brought into these southern ports and then exported from Ireland. But in 1846, as the poor are facing absolute starvation, they start to gather in these southern ports. You get the outbreak of major riots, particularly in places like Dungarvan, Waterford, Cork, all these big southern ports where the food is exported from. But unfortunately, the export of that food is forced through. There's lots of soldiers brought into Ireland to protect these huge convoys of food making their way down to these ports. And even though you get major rioting, it doesn't stop the export of food. So basically now you've got this calamity building. First of all, you've got the failure of the potato crop. And then by the late autumn of 1846, you've also had a mass export of food produced in Ireland as well. Now, on top of this, another major call in Ireland was that the government would import cheap food. But unfortunately, that British government, remember I said they were committed to these laissez-faire economic views where they don't want to intervene in the economy. They basically say that they're not going to import cheap food. They believe the most efficient way to do it is to let private merchants operate as freely as possible, and that they would import food. Now this turns out to be an absolute calamity. There's just not enough food imported into Ireland, and you can see how this might happen because Irish people by this point are already in a desperate situation. They're not going to be able to afford to buy food. So through October, November, December, while all the food has been exported and the potato crop has failed, there's not enough food imported and this cheaper food imported into Ireland to feed the population. The situation now facing Irish people by this point is absolutely desperate. So by late 1846, they've kind of passed this point of no return that sets the stage for Black 47 because there's just not enough food imported into the country, and you kind of have this gap because of the loss of the potato crop and the export of food on the one hand, and then the lack of imports on the other. And there's just not enough food left in the country by this point, and mass starvation sets in. Now, the British government didn't keep kind of centralised statistics about the amount of people that are dying, but the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force in Ireland at the time, did, and they estimated in that winter from 1846 into 1847, somewhere in the region of 400,000 people perished from starvation and famine-related diseases. That's actually an important point. Often when we hear the word famine, we assume everyone is starving to death. That's not what was happening in Ireland. The vast majority of people were dying from diseases. They just didn't live long enough to starve to death. They became weakened and then were vulnerable to these diseases. Now, calls on the British government to do something continue, and eventually they do start to put in more orders for food, which they plan to distribute in very desperate situations, but they put these orders in way too late, so that food can't arrive in the country to make a difference. Now, they do make one major intervention, and understanding this is key to understanding why 1846 is such an awful time in Ireland. It is that point of no return, as I said. So they're committed to these ideas that the market has to function. Now, if the market is going to function, the poor need money. So they devise or ramp up what's a public works scheme, where basically they're going to hire the starving poor to do work. They'll be given money for that work, and then they'll be able to buy food, theoretically at least. But this falls apart pretty much at every turn. So first of all, the work that the starving poor, remember, these people haven't had a good harvest now in over a year. So the work they're required to do is often basically kind of infrastructural projects. So at the coast, sometimes harbours are being built. In a lot of rural areas, they're building roads. And these are starving poor people who have to do this work. So very quickly, reports start appearing in the Irish and indeed the British press about people falling down dead on these projects. They're so weak that when they start to do this really heavy work, they start to collapse and die on these projects. On top of that, the wages being paid, they vary from place to place. They were about 8 to 10 pence a day, but that just was not enough money to feed a family in Ireland in late 1846 because the price of food, all food, started to rise rapidly because, as I've explained already, there was this shortfall in food. When the crops were exported, the potato failed, and then there wasn't enough imports. So the price of all food starts to rise. And now the poor, even though they're doing this work, can't get enough money together to buy food that is available. It's this absolutely tragic situation. So by December 1846, you have an awful situation in Ireland. As I've explained already, somewhere in the region of 400,000 people may have died that winter. If that figure is true, that would number about 1 in all 3 famine deaths happen in this winter of 1846, leading in to Black 47. The situation is absolutely catastrophic. Now in January, the government, and they start to open soup kitchens. And in a future video, I'm going to look at what happened when they opened those soup kitchens, because Black 47 is often regarded as the worst year of the Great Famine. And in many ways it was, but the story is also complex. So I'm going to look at what happened when they opened soup kitchens in an upcoming video that involved, weirdly, a celebrity chef of the time. But look, that's where I'm going to leave this video. I hope you've got a sense now about why 1846 is very important in the history of the Great Famine. For me anyway, I think it's a point of no return, where that crisis that many people might have hoped would abate over that year of 1846 turns into an absolute catastrophe. Now don't forget, if you do have a question, drop a comment below. I'll be making a video tomorrow where I'm going to be answering your questions from this video and previous videos. Okay, so until tomorrow when I'll be answering your questions, I'm going to sign off here. Thanks very much for taking the time to watch this video. I really appreciate it.